You know, sometimes when life gets me down, all I need is a little Sega. Oh, by the way, we're talking about the Genesis Mini 2 today! Okay, I've gotta be honest, I have never been a fan of console revisions. I guess the smaller size counts as a selling point, but a lot of the console's flavor tends to be lost in the process. Can't really put it into better words, but the revisions regularly look far less interesting than the originals. Take the Game Gear, for example. Its main selling point is color, and you make the outer shell all black? I always try to steer clear of console revisions, but there are a few exceptions. There's the PS3 Slim for not sounding like a goddamn jet engine, the Xbox 360 Elite for not red ringing all the time, the NES Top Loader for actually being able to read my fucking cartridges, they're gonna have to dock points for only supporting RF switch, the Game Boy Light for its backlit screen, the GBA SP for its backlit screen, the Nintendo DS Lite for its backlit screen. Nintendo, what the fuck are you doing? And for less practical and far more sentimental reasons, I'll always have a soft spot for the Genesis Model 2. The Genesis Model 2 was my first game console ever. It's been with my family longer than I've been alive, so it holds a special place in my heart. So naturally, when the Mega Drive Mini 2 was announced, I knew I had to get it. Over 60 games with no repeats from the first Mini, in addition to a selection of Sega CD games? Cool, but fuck that! It looks like the console I grew up with! Sign me the hell up! Honestly, I was kinda expecting this to stay in Japan, given that it was clearly a smaller scale project than the first Genesis Mini. I would have imported if it hadn't, but I'm happy the US and Europe got it too. I was really excited about the new Sega CD support. Sega has never ported Sega CD games before. This is a whole new ballgame. And before some annoying guy brings up Sonic CD in the comments, every single re-release of that game has either been the PC version or the Taxman remaster, never the Sega CD version. Furthermore, some of the games included on here were big deals in and themselves. Crusader of Senti has never been re-released before and is fucking expensive. Phantasy Star 2 now has an easy mode reminiscent of its Japan-exclusive PS2 remake. And Alien Soldier may be on Nintendo Switch Online already, but it's still something that had Sega Channel exclusivity in North America, so it's still very nice to have. Though I do wish they had opted for making a Genesis-style box art instead of just slapping the PAL box on there instead. This is the only PAL box on here, which makes it a huge eyesore next to all the Genesis games. Oh, at least we didn't get as bad as Europe did. This is like mixing Skittles and M&Ms together. And then on the Sega CD side of things, we got a couple Japan-only games that stand out even more because the Mega CD used standard CD cases instead of our bulky-ass monstrosities. On the subject of box art, a few games have had their boxes altered for the Genesis Mini 2, namely Afterburner 2, Outrun, and Super Hang-On. In Japan and Europe, this also extends to Thunder Force 4, and once more in Japan, The Revenge of Shinobi. These aren't bad changes, mind you, though the fact that Outrun has two logos now looks a bit odd. Afterburner 2 is a huge improvement though, as the original box was clearly just a stock photo that looks so out of place it's funny. This replacement cover actually originates from the TurboGrafx 16 version of the game, and I do quite like it. Why yes, I can talk about box art all day, don't test me. As for the lineup, we have a total of 61 games with no repeats from the original Genesis Mini. I mean, aside from Echo the Dolphin, Revenge of Shinobi, and Alien Soldier, but that was the Genesis version of Echo, and the latter two were only on the first Mini in different regions, so they don't count. Either way, that gives us a lineup that is very different from what typically pops up in all those Genesis collections I talked about before. In fact, I'd say only 11 of these games meet that description. This leaves us with far more room for deep cuts, third-party games, and titles that just don't get ported often, of which the Genesis Mini 2 has plenty. We got the Genesis version of Fatal Fury 2 for all you SNK fans out there, complete with bonus content that isn't in the Neo Geo version. Both Outrun and Outrunners are on here, so all bases covered for driving games. Crusader of Senti is a hidden gem that's very reminiscent of A Link to the Past in all the best ways. The fact that Populous of all games is on here is fucking hilarious to me, because not only was it an unlicensed EA game, it's also one of the only games that fails to bypass the Genesis's copy protection, meaning it was only playable on a launch model Genesis, and yet here it is, on an official plug-and-play Sega console! Another title of interest to me was Nadia the Secret of Blue Water by Namco, though it's only on the Japanese version of the Mini 2. I still haven't played this yet, but I just find it wild seeing this included because while Nadia isn't really related to Sega in any way, my brain still kind of associates them with each other just because there was a preview for the anime series on the VHS tape for Sonic OVA. Not to mention that the Grandis gang was likely the inspiration for Pink's gang in Gunstar Heroes, so you know, there's that too. Other things exclusive to the Japanese Mini include Columns 3, because I guess the likeness of Columns 3 guy was too expensive to be on more than one version of the Mini. A multitude of licensed anime games, one of which was actually made by Game Freak, and Harimanada, a game that proudly advertises itself as one of the most widely panned Mega Drive games of all time. Ladies and gentlemen, the worst thing I ever made. On the Sega CD side of things, it's unfortunately a bit lacking. There's 21 games on the Japanese Mini, but only 12 on the English one. Now this is to be expected to an extent, since the Sega CD didn't have a lot of games to begin with, and plenty were only released in Japan, but we've still got to address the elephant in the room. Yep, I'm talking about Popful Mail and the Lunar games. These 3 games are some of the most beloved titles on the Sega CD, and despite having been released in North America, they're all exclusive to the Japanese Mini. Why is this? Well, they were all localized and published by Working Designs in the West, and while they're not around anymore, their former CEO, Victor Ireland, still owns the rights to the English voice acting in the Lunar games, and possibly the whole translation of Popful Mail. And for a reason I suspect involve wanting too much money for them, they're all completely absent from the English Mini. I know for sure legal issues are the cause of their omission, because much like the first Genesis Mini, toggling the language settings also allows you to play different regional versions based on the set language. However, when setting the Japanese Mini to English, those 3 games are still the Japanese versions, meaning the localizations weren't available for use. Okay, so yeah, those games weren't available. Understandable. Why is Starblade missing from the English lineup?
Calling Starfighter Geosword. Calling Geosword. Command Geosword.
Alright, I heard you the first fucking time. You know what? It's fine. Surely we got some outstanding exclusives of our own to make up for it.
Pretend it's a game.
Sewer shark.
Shoot the tubes, dog meat!
Come on! This would have been the perfect chance to re-release Snatcher. Guess Konami didn't feel like playing nice today. Night Trap is on here too, but this is actually also on the Japanese Mini, and this is how I learned that Night Trap was released in Japan. I think Sega themselves realized the English CD lineup was looking way too small because they stuck a couple Japan exclusives in there for good measure, those being Night Striker and the Ninja Warriors. These are games that don't have a language barrier, making them a solid pick, but unfortunately they prevent the menu from looking uniform! Thankfully, the other stuff we got is solid. Final Fight CD is a nice cathartic beat-em-up. Mansion of Hidden Souls is an interesting inclusion, and it actually has mouse support too, though sadly the Genesis mouse that came with your copy of Wacky Worlds doesn't work, so what is the fucking point? It was also nice playing the original Sega CD version of Sonic CD for the first time. I've owned an actual copy for years now, but since I don't have a Sega CD, I've yet to play it. You're not missing much. I'd take the PS3 remaster or Sonic Origins over it any day, but at least I can finally scratch it off my list. Not to mention, if it wasn't included, then the only Sonic game on here would be Sonic 3D Blast, and that timeline just sounds depressing. Emulation is about what you'd expect from M2, by which I mean outstanding! This is even less lag than the Genesis Mini, and I barely noticed it in that either. I may not have had a signpost test to work with this time, but everything came out sounding exactly how I'd expect it to. Hell, they even give you the option to switch the audio between the Genesis models 1 and 2, which is probably an audiophile's wet dream. It's so unnecessary, but welcome nonetheless. The only quirk I noticed was the voice samples in Ristar being slightly lower pitched, which is tolerable until Planet Sonata, where things get pretty miserable. The weird thing is that this is only an issue in Ristar. The samples in other games like Bonanza Bros or the aforementioned Ahari Manada sound as you would expect, so I'm not sure what went wrong here. Some of the inclusions on here are games that weren't even able to run on the original Genesis Mini, most notably Virtua Racing, which is still to this day a technical marvel while at the same time being hard as fuck! Not to mention that several games got the same overclocking treatment Mega Man got last time to reduce slowdown, affectionately referred to as Terra Drive mode, which is just such a wonderful feature that needs to become the standard for retro ports, though whether or not these games would run that well on an actual Terra Drive is a question I would not be able to answer. This is probably the best official Genesis emulator there is right now, and I'm glad we've made so much progress since the Sega Smash Pack. With Sega CD, the waters are a bit murkier since I've never actually played anything on a legit Sega CD before, but for a first attempt, it's solid. I haven't noticed any glaring issues like, yeah, Sonic CD is a janky, sluggish mess, but that game was always that way before the Taxman remaster. I may have heard a slight audio delay during FMVs, but I'm not even sure about that one. I may not have anything to compare it to, but it's good, and a solid way to play Sega CD games. But this wouldn't be a full look at the Genesis Mini 2 if I didn't spend some time talking about the bonus games, so let me just do that real quick. While the original Genesis Mini just had a couple ports of arcade games, the Genesis Mini 2 has far more bonus content than every other mini console to date. We're talking arcade ports, unreleased games, and even a few brand new titles. These might as well be the main attraction, so I'm going to be looking at them all in detail. Let's start with Viewpoint, an isometric shmup which from my perspective as an American doesn't really count as a bonus game. We actually got this one. Look, here's me playing it on an actual Genesis right now. The reason for this game's branding as a bonus game comes from the fact that it's the only America exclusive game on the Japanese Mini. They even made brand new Mega Drive box art for it, and did the same for Europe as well, you know, despite not doing the same for any of the other games. The main reason for its inclusion was to represent Sammy, since they've been a part of SEGA since the takeover in 2004 after going third party wasn't enough to save them from bankruptcy. Let me tell you though, Viewpoint is the perfect title for this game because your worst enemy will be the isometric point of view. Depth perception sucks here, and the cutoff on the top right corner of the screen is rather unnerving because you never know when something's gonna come flying in from that spot. Also, when you die in this game, you're sent back to a checkpoint, which in a shmup with limited lives is just frustrating. On the other hand though, the massive slowdown from the original release has been eliminated and the control feels very smooth, so I don't tense up too much when I'm trying to dodge giant slinkies. Not much else to say about this one. It's alright, but it's the kind of game I just want to play until my first game over in an arcade. It's kind of fun, but not play to the end fun. Alright, now let's look at some new arcade ports. We got Fantasy Zone, Spatter, and Super Locomotive! We'll start off with Fantasy Zone since it's easily the most popular of the three. For those who don't know, Fantasy Zone alongside Twinbee is one of the original Q-em-ups, though where Twinbee was more of a traditional vertical shooter, except for Burn and Twinbee, but shut up. Fantasy Zone is a horizontal free-roaming game. Your goal is basically to fly around this colorful, infinitely looping space and destroy all these guys that spit out enemies while taking care not to get killed yourself. After which it's boss time and you get to fight Wooden Block Jim over here. Damn, I heard of pea shooters, but this is ridiculous. You can also collect money to be used in the shop to buy upgrades, allowing you to fly real fast or shoot in 7 directions. Or if you don't feel like risking your life to build up your wealth, there's this new super easy mode where you start off with $1 bajillion and can buy whatever you want. Very satisfying, you know, until you run out of ammo or die, then you're back to square one. Next up is Spatter. This was released in arcades in 1984, which you can kind of tell because it's kind of got that Master System vibe to it, if you know what I mean. In this game, you ride your tricycle around an obstacle course and try to pick up all the flowers while avoiding the enemies in your path. It's kind of like an overhead version of Flicky. You can deal with enemies by simply staying out of their path, jumping against the fence to swerve around them, or my personal favorite, hitting the fence from the opposite side to send them flying. This alone is super fun to do. Oh shit, here they come! Yeah! Oh fuck yeah, 2 at once! Beyond the occasional bonus stage, there isn't much else to this one, but I had a lot of fun with it regardless, so it gets my seal of approval. Last of the arcade ports is Super Locomotive! This was released in arcades in 1982, and this new Genesis port was developed alongside Spatter by M2 in their spare time a whole 10 years before actually getting released. The aim of the game is to keep an eye on both the top and bottom screens, making an effort to switch tracks and avoid enemy trains and helicopters hell-bent on your absolute destruction. Pressing the B button turns you into Super Locomotive! Which makes you completely invincible for a short while. You know, there are some games out there where I have to look at it and wonder how someone managed to come up with an idea like this, and Super Locomotive is absolutely one of those games. The plot synopsis in the manual is also pure gold. Run, invincible locomotive! Run like the wind! Smash through your enemies! Blast them with smoke! Make your way to the station beyond! Defeat the evil army that took over your railroad! May your victory be swift! Gotta be blunt, I found this one a bit frustrating to play. I'm not great at multitasking, and I found avoiding the enemies to be a bit harder than I would have liked. The idea is cool, but the game isn't really for me. Moving on. Next on our list is Debbie & P. This game was developed in 1992 by Sonic Team's own Takashi Iizuka, but went unreleased and was completely unheard of until the announcement of its inclusion in the Mini. Gotta be honest, I don't think this box art would have looked like this had it been released in America. We were all about edge back then rather than, nude angels. Oh, still in Japanese. Well, I sure hope we don't need to be able to read this to enjoy the game. Oh my god, is that the sun?! Oh, hello there, miss. Gomenasai. Watashi wa Nihongo o hanashimasen. Man, don't you hate it when you see a naked angel suddenly transform into hiragana? Alright, so in this game you're supposed to control 2 paddles and collect the angels with the top one while knocking out the devils with the bottom one. They look more like inanimate carbon rods than paddles, but I can think of nothing more suited for a task like this than that. You control the bottom paddle with the D-pad and the top paddle with the A and B buttons. This is kinda hard to keep track of. I bet this game would be more enjoyable with 2 players, but I haven't tried to do that yet. Oh hey, the lady from before is back. Oh, she's pissed! The other unreleased game is Starmobile, another puzzle game. This game was developed by Mindware and had been released once on the Sharp X68000, but the Genesis version never saw the light of day until now. This game is pretty simple. You just balance stars on a scale and try your best to maintain an even balance. Different colored stars have different weights, so you need to keep track of that. You clear the level when you've sandwiched enough stars between the other stars. Not sure what this lady on the cover has to do with any of this, or why she looks so sad for that matter. Maybe it's the depressing title screen music that's getting to her. Starmobile is a fairly addicting falling block game that I'm sure puzzle fans will be able to find plenty of enjoyment out of, but to be honest, I'd still take Puyo Puyo over it any day. Speaking of which, what do you do when you run out of Genesis Puyo games? How about backport the Saturn game to the Genesis? I've always said Sega is fucking insane, and shit like this is why. Versus Puyo Puyo Sun is a watered-down Genesis port of Puyo Puyo Sun, a game made for more advanced hardware. It's so weird seeing official Puyo box art with the English Genesis template though. The verses in the name refers to the fact that it only has versus mode, as M2 has gone on record to state that they didn't have enough time to finish the cutscenes, or even the AI for that matter. You can tell they were intended to be included at first too, because the sound test has some tracks you won't be hearing in the main game at all. In spite of those missing features, it still runs like a dream, and they didn't hold back on the presentation either. For one thing, the spell effects are still here, even if they lack full animations like the original game. Not a hint of slowdown either, and the Genesis arrangements of the music are outstanding. Puyo Sun already had my favorite soundtrack in the series, but these new arrangements not only sound authentic to Puyo 2's instruments, but they also sound great in their own right. We also have a couple new rule sets. Alongside the normal rule set, there's a new fusion rule where Sun Puyo fuse with regular Puyo instead of obstructing your chains, which I'm sure a lot of Puyo fans will enjoy. There's also the Fading Sun rule, where I think you just can't tell which Puyos are fused with Sun Puyos. I'm not sure about that one. Also, if you don't have a buddy to play with, you can spend some time in exercise mode to practice your chains. I really hope that if M2 gets the opportunity, they can finish up this port and sell it on an actual Genesis cart like they did with Darius. Or if not that, Nintendo Switch Online would also probably work. As a collector, I hope for the former, but honestly, I'd be fine with either. This was a highlight of the mini for me. Okay, so next we have Party Quiz Mega Q 2022, a bonus game exclusive to the Japanese mini. This is a quiz game designed to be a modern version of 1993's Party Quiz Mega Q, which was also featured on the first Mega Drive Mini in Japan. The main difference being that this game has questions relevant to the modern day instead of the early 90s. I love how the whole thing is structured like an actual Japanese TV broadcast. It allows me to really feel like this game is sponsored by the Buffalo USB reissue of the SEGA Tap, or as we call it in the US, the Team Player, which also doesn't work on the Genesis Mini 2, so fuck me, I guess. But with a USB hub, up to 5 people can play together. It's like Sega knew I had 5 USB Genesis controllers laying around. There's only one problem with all that. Language barrier! Remember I said this was only on the Japanese Mini? Yeah, you're not playing this in English. I'm not really surprised about this, to be honest. I can think of 3 good reasons why they didn't bother to translate it. 1. It's based on a game that was only released in Japan to begin with. 2. Sega of America and Sega Europe weren't very involved with the Mini 2, so they were probably limited in translators. 3. This is just a guess, but I suspect the questions are very pop culture focused, and replacing those questions with ones that were suitable for both the US and the UK would have probably been a nightmare, and that's not even getting into the other 6 languages they'd have to localize for. It's a real shame though, because I really wanted to try out its sister title, Party Quiz Sega Q. This is more or less the same game, but now the questions are focused on Sega's history, and the host is now the legendary Takenobu Mitsuyoshi. In spite of everything though, I tried to wing it, and actually managed to get the first 2 questions right just because they had enough English letters that I was able to put 2 and 2 together. Oh, one of the options is GD-ROM? This must be a question about the Dreamcast. Project Diva, eh? Well, I know Miku can be read as 39. Yeah! Who knows? Maybe a fan will translate this for us one of these days, though I think we need to figure out how to emulate these new games before we can even think about something like that happening. Alright, last on our list is Space Harrier 2. Yep, that's Space Harrier 2, the game that was already on the Genesis day 1 and was included on the original Genesis Mini. What the fuck kind of bonus game is this? The kind that you wish you had in 1989, that's what! Ask anyone what the biggest issue with Space Harrier 2 is, and there's a good chance they'll tell you it's the lack of sprite scaling. Well, Thanks to our friends at M2, we now get to see what the game would be like if the Genesis actually supported it, and the difference is just sublime. It's really cool seeing the Genesis pull off what you would otherwise need a Sega CD or 32X for, though if you want to get technical, it's actually the totally fictional Sega Mark V. I also love how they present this as a new version of the game simply by swapping the box art template with the later red box variation. Same with Japan and Europe's blue boxes. And that's not all. It also comes with a brand new port of the original Space Harrier, which also uses the new sprite scaling feature. Man, this is just nice to have. The Genesis Mini 2 feels even more like a love letter to 16-bit Sega than the original Mini, which is very impressive when the original had the majority of the console's greatest hits. Sega's come a long way, but that doesn't stop them from celebrating their history. Well, that may be because they haven't had a console to promote for a long time. Honestly, I wonder what it would take to get another Sega console without the risk of bankruptcy. Given that PlayStation kinda sucks these days, Xbox has never really been for me, and Nintendo is off doing their own thing, I wouldn't mind seeing them re-enter the game, see if they'd be able to shake things up. Of course, I highly doubt it's happening anytime soon, but I'd still love to see it happen someday, preferably with a better outcome this time around. Anyway, get the Genesis Mini 2, it's unmistakably the best mini console yet. Hurry up, stock's limited, so you better get on this shit ASAP! So yeah, the Genesis Mini 2, it's pretty cool, but let me tell you, it's gonna have nothing on the Genesis Mini Mini.